Thank you for singing Ride On, Ride On. Brad was describing that hymn to the choir earlier as the rawhide theme. But we may not have a donkey, but you could almost hear the clip-clop of the colt's hooves with that. Thank you. So it's Palm Sunday, and it's a funny thing about history. It tends to be written by those in power, and of course those in their pay, their scribes. Donald Trump makes the news, not so many of the American immigrants. Kim Kardashian has millions of Twitter followers, not so the women who clean her houses. But here's the thing. Contrary to all of that, contrary to the history of power, we have this book. It's called the Bible, and it is a history of the people, the people's history. So today we learn about Jesus, this relatively insignificant rabbi of his day, who walked into Jerusalem knowing he was going to die in a few days, surrounded by rabble. Rabble, it's a Middle English word. It means people who are the equivalent of animals. The hoi polloi, the nameless. Those were the people following him in his little procession on a colt. But what was recorded by Josephus and the historians of the day was not anything about this procession. We know about it. What they recorded was another procession into Jerusalem, and that was a procession of Pontius Pilate, who also came into Jerusalem that day, but the head of an army, the Roman army. And we can picture them, you know, with their tunics, their red tunics, kind of ironic that red is the color of the day, and their iron and their might and their majesty. And they were meant to terrify. They were meant to terrify the Jews because they feared the Jews and a physical insurrection. This actually was leading into Passover, of course, in Jerusalem. And what did the Jews celebrate in Passover but their freedom, the freedom of slaves from slavery under Egypt? And that message wasn't lost on the Romans and the people in power. They were afraid of just such an uprising. That was a procession that was recorded by the historians. Who writes history is important. There's scant mention of Jesus in the writings of Josephus, who was a historian of the day, unreliable, but in the pay of power. But there was lots about rulers and their whims. The only focus on the enslaved, the occupied, the oppressed was not surprisingly recorded by the oppressed, the occupied, and the enslaved. The nameless folk who waved those palms and put down their coats and called Hosanna. But let's be realistic about those folk too. They really didn't want the kind of Messiah Jesus turned out to be. What they really yearned for, and we can understand it, they really wanted a political Messiah. They wanted someone who would overturn the power of Rome, who would take back Jerusalem. They wanted someone who could perform magic, the magical Jesus, just like he healed people. They wanted that man who rode into town in the manner of King David before him to do what David had done, to be a ruler, to be the new person of power in Jerusalem, that incredible city, that city of dreams and hopes and, of course, sadness. Now, when I was a little kid, apologies to those who didn't grow up around here or who grew up in rural Alberta, I grew up in the Annex, blocks from here. And I remember when I thought about what heaven was like and what utopia looked like, it was Toronto. It was Toronto. I just thought this was the most beautiful city. I didn't know any others, but I thought this was the most beautiful city. And I was so happy. I was a happy child. And although I had, like most of us, a dysfunctional family, at least they loved me. I was one of the lucky ones. So they loved me, and I was coming home from school, and my dream was just to make it safely to home without those bully boys chasing me. So to get home in this beautiful city, that was my idea of heaven, and I just wanted it to go on forever. Now, Toronto in those days didn't quite have the homeless problem it does now, and on one salary, you could own a home back then. But it was phenomenally racist, misogynist, homo, bi, and transphobic. It was far from heaven. Far, far from heaven. But just like the Jews that followed Jesus, who dreamed of Jerusalem, the city that they thought was heavenly, that modeled utopia for them, they thought that the only difference was if they were in power in Jerusalem, it would all be okay. Well, the problem is, of course, and the history of the Bible tells us, and the history of the world tells us, that when they gain power, when anyone gains power, they tend to repeat just what their oppressors did. And one could argue Jerusalem is in no way different today. So the procession led by Pilate, the one that's recorded by historians, like all armies, wasn't interested in any of this. They weren't interested in faith. They were trained, of course, to deal with insurrection of the physical variety. Can you imagine what they must have thought when they saw this little band of hoi polloi, of slaves, of women following Jesus? They must have thought, is this the best they could do? Well, this means nothing. We win, and we will continue to win. In fact, you know, as the people screamed just a few days later for the crucifixion of Jesus because he let them down, he wasn't the political Messiah, he couldn't even save himself, as you've heard. I imagine that the Romans who were educated, who were worldly, thought yet again, look at these people. They're rabble, they're savages, they're uneducated. They don't even know what they want. They are easily controlled. If anything should give us hope in this reminder, this Holy Week reminder of just how ugly humans can be and how dark the historical time can seem, it is that for all historians of empire, the rendition of history billions are reading around the world today is not their account, it's the people's account of that day. In fact, Pilate, if he's mentioned at all, he's just a minor player in the drama that ensues during Holy Week. For him, crucifixions happened all the time. It happened all the time. No historians would have noted this one particularly much. But there's such a thing as God's time, kairos over chronos. And our Bible tells us that story. It's a mixture of myth, of fact, of stories told around a campfire. It's stories rarely written down until much, much, much after the fact. It's the people's history. It's what we hear today. Wouldn't Pilate be surprised? You know, Jesus said, the meek shall inherit the earth. Well, look, we have. We have. Billions of us around the world will read the story of a penniless rabbi who was killed by an occupying power this week. Millions of us will read this in these magnificent buildings. And there isn't a Roman centurion to be seen anywhere. We repeat the story so that we don't have to repeat the story. We repeat it so that we don't watch Pilate's parade. We're not distracted by power and the vestiges of power and the trappings of power. We read the story so that we don't repeat the story, so that we look at who really counts. Those folk that don't have the followers, that don't have the media on their side, those people, those processions, those individuals, those nameless ones among us. We repeat this story so that we don't repeat this story, so that we don't have to die to recognize that we are next to the divine, so that we can recognize that we are next to the divine every single day. I've always been fascinated with purported last words of famous folk. But anybody who's in the healthcare field who's actually sat with people who are dying know that most people don't say something witty, wise as their dying words. Most dying words are far from that. But there's truth to them. Perhaps not historical fact, but real truth. So my favorite supposed dying line was said by Oscar Wilde. And he said as he lay dying, probably in some seedy motel in Paris, Oscar said, "Either the wallpaper goes or I do." Now, apparently, Lady Jane Astor said as she drifted in and out of consciousness, seeing her entire family gathered around her bed, she said, "I'm either dying or it's my birthday," which is good. Humphrey Bogart was reported to have said, "I should never have switched from scotch to martinis." But the one that I remember this week wasn't supposed to be funny, but it was appropriate. They were reported to be, probably not really, but they were reported to be Che Guevara's last lines, just before he was assassinated in Bolivia. As the gunmen were approaching, Che was said to have said, "Go ahead, cowards, shoot. All you're going to kill is a man." Again, piece of Cuban propaganda, I'm sure. It may not be fact, but like people's history, it's so true. It's so true. I remember as a little kid hearing a recording of Paul Robeson singing a song originally penned by a poet, Alfred Hayes, about a union organizer and songwriter who was assassinated in 1914 in a strike. His name was Joe Hill. The song is called "I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night." And these are a couple of the verses. Joan Baez made it popular. "I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. But Joe, you're 10 years dead," said I. "I never died," said he. "I never died," said he. "The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe," says I. "Takes more than guns to kill a soul," says Joe. "I did not die. I did not die." In a similar way, our Bible tells us the history of slaves, of women, of eunuchs, of outcasts, of criminals, of the sick, of the dying, of the murdered, from their point of view. It writes poems about them, songs and prose about them. It sings of them and from them. As I said, part myth, story, fact, broad sweep of God's truth and kairos, of thousands of years, of hundreds of stories of humans' interaction with the divine. It starts with the creation of creation, and it ends, in one sense, on Golgotha, with the death of the pinnacle of creation, who we are told is a hated, vilified Jew from a backwater town in an occupied country. And as an atheist, I always thought that Jesus' last lines were a lie too. I, along with others, felt that history, the history we learn in schools, was fact, and that the facts were written by those in the pay of those in power. I may not have liked it, but I believed in that history religiously. Josephus acknowledged the existence of Jesus, but that was about it. No mention of much of the Gospels, Acts, and epistles were part of his chronicle. Yes, Jesus was crucified, as were so many. Certainly he died, and certainly he stayed dead. The Roman parade was a fact. The Jewish procession was not. Another day in Jerusalem of no historical significance. So none of Jesus' last lines were recorded. Who was left to listen to them anyway? Except a small group of women. And this is something we should hold up, because the reason we know Christ's last words were a group of women, the reason we know about the resurrection were a group of women historians. And they didn't write it down. They were probably illiterate, but they recorded it in the way that counts. And they told it over campfires and in deserts. And later, when it was threatened to be lost, only then did people write it down in prisons and in caves. It was women who were there. They were the only ones left at the foot of the cross that were there because they loved this man. It was women who told us of the male disciples' betrayals. It was women who remembered the horrors of the torture and the long walk of the Via Dolorosa. It was women who reminded survivors of the actions of the crowd. It was women who watched as the soldiers stripped him and bartered his clothes. This is a woman's story told by women who loved. It is their story. It was a woman who told us through the centuries that there were two thieves, two criminals crucified next to Jesus. One of the criminals looks at Jesus and says, you know, whatever you say, we did something, we were sentenced, and it was just. But this man, this crazy man who thinks he's the Messiah, he really didn't do anything wrong. One can imagine the women straining in to hear Jesus' dying words as he says to them, "Today you will be with me in paradise." They carry those words with them, and they pass them on to anyone who would listen, and then to their children and their children, their children's children, and then to us, and then to me. As an atheist, I couldn't unhear them because, you see, even if they are a lie, even if the women invented those words, what manner of human would invent such words? These words are truly divine. These are the words of God speaking to us. No matter what we believe or think about historical fact, that in the moment of torture, someone could turn and say to someone else being tortured, "Today, right now, you will be with me in paradise." He said some other things too. He said, "I thirst," so they reported, straining in to hear. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He said, "It is finished." He said, "Behold your son, behold your mother." All so very human, all so very human. And he also said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Intimate, childlike words from someone suffering in God's time, the best time in Kairos, the very proof that forgiveness comes before repentance biblically. Nobody did anything, and nobody does anything ever to earn those words. Those words are a gift, a divine gift to each of us. Even as we kill creation, even as we kill the pinnacle of creation, hear those words said to us. Father, forgive them, intimate, a child's words. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. But it hits us, it kind of punches us. It's kind of a punch to the spiritual gut, isn't it, to hear them? Because then it calls upon us to change our entire lives, our entire world. It calls upon us to react, to do something, to say something, to be someone, the someone who reacts to those words, those beautiful divine words, those words that aren't human, much more than human. Our response to those words is what we are called to spend our lives doing. There's the world of history, the world of power and fact, and then there's God's world, the world of truth and love. We know, don't we, which is more real. And so we say, yes. It's the only thing we can say is, yes, I hear you. Yes, I will respond. Yes, yes, God, yes, yes. Or the way they say in the Bible, amen.